Street Station is the smaller of Glasgow's two mainline termini and is located on an extremely restricted site. At the immediate end of the platforms, the train enters a 1.5 mile long tunnel on a rising gradient of 1 in 45. The incline was too steep for early steam locomotives, and so trains were originally hauled by cable from a static steam engine at Alrx. The West Highland Line is nearly 100 miles in length and runs from Helensburgh to Fort William, with a further 42 miles west to Mallaig. For the first 10 miles or so, West Highland trains run through the sprawling suburbs of Scotland's largest conurbation. Singer is one example, a name synonymous with the New Jersey sewing machine manufacturer who established a factory here in 1883. The Strathclyde electric line follows the northern banks of the River Clyde. Looking back, the skyline is dominated by the Erskine Toll Bridge, opened in 1971 by Princess Anne, the most westerly fixed crossing of the river. We are now approaching Craigyendoran, where the West Highland Railway proper begins. The remaining mile or so of the electrified commuter line to Helensburgh Central diverges to the left, while we climb up and around the back of the town in order to gain height. Helensburgh marks the end of the industrial belt around Glasgow. The town was founded in 1776 and became a popular resort. It was also the birthplace of John Logie Baird, one of the pioneers of the invention of television. Emerging from a 7-mile run through dense forest high above Gairloch, travellers get their first sight of the classic West Highland Station at Gairloch Head. The distinctive Swiss chalet-style buildings, an island platform, complete with typical but disused signal box. Since the introduction of a sophisticated radio signalling system in 1988, all the intermediate stations have been unstaffed, although someone still tends to the odd flower basket here. The landmass narrows to just 1.25 miles wide, separating Loch Long from Loch Lomond, the latter being familiar to many due to the famous song lamenting its bonny, bonny banks. The North British Railway had a considerable stake in this popular tourist area, having taken control of the Loch Lomond steamships. Out alongside Loch Lomond, the line now meanders through a dense forest of birch trees, economically hugging the hillside contours. The typical mass of Ben Vorlich, with a peak of 3,094 feet, towers above the line. Dozens of small bridges carry the line over mountain streams, the dry beds of which become torrents in winter. This is the land of hydroelectric power, where pipes funnel water from Loch Sloy into a generating station. To blend in with the landscape around Loch Lomond, Craigyendoran Viaduct was built, with 8 arches and grand castellated parapets. This was an exceptionally difficult section of line to build, squeezed as it is on a narrow ledge blasted out of solid rock. 60 miles from Glasgow, the train stops at the former railway crossroads of Clydebank. The Callander and Oban line from Edinburgh approached through Glendocket from the east, but closed in 1965, leaving Clydebank as the junction for the remaining branch to Oban. In the days before restaurant cars, West Highland trains used to take an extended break here to allow passengers to take refreshments. We are now in Argyllshire, perched on a high ledge overlooking Glen Ork, the view spanning a wide panorama stretching all the way to Bridge of Orkney. In the foreground, one of General Wade's old military roads forming a part of the West Highland Way. The famous and well-trodden route for walkers extends all the way from Milngavie to Fort William. Bridge of Orkney marked the boundary of civilization when the railway was built. Even today there is only a handful of houses and a hotel here. The bridge was on the old military road where it crossed the River Orkney. Now the A82 trunk road parts company and heads northwest towards Glencoe and Ballachulish. The railway, leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind, climbs northeast alongside the water of Tulla towards Rannoch Moor. In the middle of the wilderness lies Gordon, established here purely to provide a passing place for the trains. With traditional signalling, that meant providing the staff to work it. Until 1968, a signal box stood on an island platform attached to a small house, where the signalman and his family lived. An old coach body was provided for the children's education. It was Britain's remotest schoolhouse. Rannoch Hotel appears in the distance. The tiny community lies at the end of a 16-mile-long road from Kinloch Rannoch, and a similar distance again to the nearest large town of Pitlochry. Just to the north of Rannoch Station, a 1,000-foot wide depression required the building of a high embankment and the line's largest and most expensive viaduct. Rannoch Viaduct is 684 feet long and 50 feet high. In 1895, just after the railway opened, one of the worst winters in living memory rendered the route across the moors impassable for weeks on end, and snow fences were subsequently erected either side of the line in the areas most prone to drifting. The remains of Lugna Shooting Lodge, reflecting a way of life going back centuries, when parties of gentlemen would venture out onto the moors in search of game. With the social changes around the time of the First World War, the dozens of lodges fell into disrepair. We now turn to the north, high above Loch Clydebank, itself as isolated and unspoilt as the day the railway was built. The line hugs the eastern bank of the loch for 5 miles, dropping over 260 feet in the process. The train traverses the ledge, perched precariously above Monacy Gorge. Not so spectacular in summer months, but in winter, a series of spectacular cascading waterfalls. This is Fort William Junction, where the Mallaig line joins. Towering above Fort William is Ben Nevis, Britain's highest mountain, at 4,406 feet above sea level. Fort William is the main tourist centre for the West Highlands, and each summer a regular service of steam trains runs over the West Highland branch from Fort William to Mallaig, still a vital link to the various islands off the west coast throughout the year. The line is reputedly Britain's most scenic railway, so climb aboard and sample the delights of the road to the Isles. At Bannerby, the train crosses a swing bridge over the southern end of the Caledonian Canal. This locomotive, known as a Black 5, is named after one of the great railway pioneers, George Stephenson. It was built at Crewe in 1947 by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, but ironically only served 1 day for the LMS before being taken over by British Railways. Glenfinnan Viaduct is the most spectacular on the line. It was built by Robert McAlpine out of concrete. The stone around these parts was found to be unworkable, and so concrete was pioneered here. Bonnie Prince Charlie's monument was erected at Glenfinnan to commemorate the very spot where he first raised his standard to gather support for his uprising in 1745. This pretty spot is the highest point on the West Highland extension at 361 feet above sea level. The steam crews have to be pretty fit. The fireman has to shovel no less than 1.5 tons of coal during the 42-mile trip, and he's got another 1.5 tons to shovel on the way back. As there is no physical connection between the various locks en route to Mallaig, before the railway came, the 42-mile journey was over 100 by water. The determined traveller went by way of Loch Linney from Fort William in a southwesterly direction. He then sailed west through the Sound of Mull, and from there north to Mallaig for 50 miles along the Atlantic coast. After Thomas Telford brought the first road to these parts in 1815, a coach used to run between Fort William and Alrx, but even this improvement was only available 3 times a week, and the journey time for the 34 miles amounted to 7 hours. The train departs Alrx, Britain's most westerly mainland station. From Alrx you can catch a ferry to the quaintly named islands of Egg, Muck and Rum. Here the road and railway part company. The road takes a narrow, winding and hilly coastal path to Mallaig, while the railway crosses Keppoch Moss. Robert McAlpine and Sons had to literally float the line across Keppoch Moss, with tons of turf and brushwood forming the track bed, just as George Stephenson himself had done some 70 years earlier at Chat Moss on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. the Atlantic Ocean appears. It's normally a 5.5-hour journey from Glasgow to Mallaig, and in that 165 miles, the weather can change dramatically. Over the years, many a passenger has left Glasgow in the pouring rain, only to find themselves half a day later in glorious sunshine, with warm westerly breezes coming in off the Atlantic. The port of Mallaig was actually built by the North British Railway, their eyes firmly fixed on the lucrative fish traffic, herring being the main catch. In recent years, however, herring has died out, and it's now crayfish that is landed by the ton. From the sparsely populated West Highlands